Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Fostering Collective Teacher Efficacy, led by Jenni Donohoo. Before we get started, just a couple of words about Walden University, who's collaborating with us today on this webinar. Designed to help educators seek a better way to pursue advanced degrees, Walden is an accredited university that offers a variety of programs, from teacher preparation to doctoral degrees that connect educators with nationally recognized education experts, policymakers, and scholar practitioners who are driving change and influence the future of education. For more information about their courses and services, stay tuned until the end of the session where we'll talk a little bit more about Walden. Today, I'm going to ask if you have questions for Jenni, please send them using the chat function. So don't use the Q&A function. Please use the chat function and send those questions when you think of them, and we will get to as many of your questions as possible at the end of the event. Now, on to the webinar. I'd like to pass the microphone over to Dan Alpert to introduce today's presenter.
Thank you. Good afternoon and good evening to those of you on the East Coast. I'm Dan Alpert, Program Director and Publisher for Corwin, and it's my great pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Jenni Donohoo. Jenni has had a distinguished career in education and has worn many hats, including that of classroom teacher, higher educator, research and program evaluation consultant with the Greater Essex School Board, and more recently, Jenni has been on contract with the Ontario Ministry of Education. She has also served as the president of the Ontario Learning Forward affiliate and is a longtime Corwin consultant. Jenni is also one very talented author, something I can attest to since I served as her editor on 3 Corwin book projects. Her groundbreaking work on collaborative inquiry and collective efficacy have been widely cited in the literature on professional learning, and more importantly, have positively impacted the practice of thousands of educators. We're about to embark on our 4th book project together, and I'm so looking forward to continuing to learn from Jenni. But rather than delay any longer, I'll leave it to our presenter to carry on. Go for it, Jenni.
Thank you, Dan. In some schools, collective efficacy is present amongst faculty. Teachers are rolling up their sleeves and doing what it takes to meet the needs of all students, even those who are disengaged or disadvantaged. And you'll see here from this quote from a teacher that sometimes teachers realize that what they do, they can make a measurable difference for students by accommodating students' needs. But unfortunately, the belief that there is nothing we can do to reach some students is pervasive in some schools as well. And when collective efficacy is lacking, there are serious consequences. Students who struggle academically will continue to experience difficulty if they receive instruction from teachers who have a weakened sense of collective efficacy. And when teachers lack efficacy beliefs, they weaken students' sense of self-efficacy. Collective efficacy impacts how teams think, feel, motivate themselves, and behave. We also know that the relationship between collective efficacy and results has been established in research in multiple domains, as diverse as sports, business, and neighborhood crime. This is not a new notion, and the research base on collective efficacy in education dates back more than 30 years. So to define collective efficacy, you can see a couple definitions here on the screen. They're really future-oriented beliefs about how well a team can perform in a specific situation or a specific context. They're judgments of teachers that they can organize and execute courses of actions that are required to have a positive impact on student learning. And I really love the Shannon Moran and Barr definition that you see there, that teachers in a given school make an educational difference to their students over and above the educational impact of their homes and communities. I just want to share the results from one particular study, but I want to note the importance of the fact that there are multiple studies. This is just one example, and the research based on this is widely established. But this particular study was interesting to me. It took place in Texas, and in Texas, they have an agency that rates schools, and I'm sure that wherever you're from, you could probably identify with this, that the rating systems in schools, in Texas in particular, some schools are rated as superior and some as substandard on a statewide test. Now, some schools are excelling while others were failing to meet the minimum standard. In this particular study, what they all had in common was that the schools qualified as serving economically disadvantaged students. And what the researchers would have done in this study is a random sample of the schools who failed to meet the minimum standard and schools who excelled in all areas for 2 consecutive years on the state test. And then what they found was the collective efficacy of teachers in the superior campuses was significantly higher than those in the unacceptable campuses. Basically, teachers' beliefs played a larger role in predicting student outcomes than students' prior achievement and or socioeconomic status. And again, this is just one study. There are multiple studies that show that. And at the end of the webinar, I have a citation that will draw you to a research summary that will direct you to additional studies if you're interested in knowing more about that. But this notion about what matters most in increasing student achievement, we think about the work on part of teachers and teams who are experiencing success and seeing measurable gains in student achievement. When you're part of a team that you realize substantial progress can be made with students, it can be very empowering. And coming to that realization that collectively your team is capable of meeting the challenges we face in schools and classrooms builds a team's confidence. Collective efficacy, when it's present, results in motivation, persistence, greater efforts on part of the team. Basically, collective efficacy results in greater productive patterns of behavior on the part of the adults in the building. When collective efficacy is established, it results in the implementation of evidence-based approaches in schools and classrooms. And this is why collective efficacy yields such a high effect size, as demonstrated here, of 1.57 based on Professor Hattie's visible learning research. Another way of looking at this is to say that collective efficacy is 3 times more powerful and predictive of student achievement than things like socioeconomic status, home environment, parental involvement, and student motivation. And the research shows, and Professor Hattie's synthesis shows, that collective teacher efficacy is more than 2 times more powerful and predictive of student achievement than things like students' prior achievement and effective instructional strategies such as giving effective feedback. So in order to, I think, understand how to influence a team's interpretation of their effectiveness, it's important to consider how beliefs are formed. And the research shows that beliefs are formed based on past experiences. And we'll look at these a little more closely: mastery experiences, vicarious experiences, social persuasion, and affective states. A mastery experience basically is when teams have experienced success and they come to believe and build their confidence that if they put forth the same amount of effort, or if they utilized similar strategies, that they'd be able to have success again in the future. They expect that effective performances will be repeated. And when we think of mastery experiences, I go back to some of the earlier work of Tom Guskey. And what Tom's research showed was that when we think of these things that you see here on the screen, what comes first? I'll just pause for a second and give you a chance to consider, if you had to order these chronologically, what would you place first, second, third, and fourth? And if we were together in a workshop, we'd spend more time face-to-face thinking about this. But given this environment, I'm just going to share with you, what some of the theory and research says is that basically professional learning would take place. This would be the first item on the list, that a group or an individual learns about a new evidence-based strategy, and then the educators try that in their practice. They try something new in their classroom. And as they see evidence of increases in student learning, they begin to change their beliefs. Now, this is a very cyclical, more so than a linear process, and it's a simple way to describe a complicated process. But that idea that we change our beliefs when we see an increase in student learning really resonates with me, because I think that's the essence of a mastery experience. And there's essential elements of mastery experiences, this notion of learning together, but not only learning from the successes we've had, but considering what we can learn from mistakes and failures as well. And recently, I found a research study that examined collective efficacy in organizations. And they found 3 interesting patterns where there are upward spirals of efficacy, downward spirals, and then self-correcting spirals. Upward spirals were described or characterized by overconfidence, while downward spirals were characterized by a lack of confidence, and self-correcting spirals were characterized by learning. And the study showed that while you might think that an upward spiral seems ideal, that when teams have upward spirals of, continuous success, it fosters less attention to and the filtering of information in such a way that confirms previous successes, basically that idea of overconfidence. And it reduces the team's search for feedback and attention to it because they see no reason for change. And what they showed in this study was that self-correcting spirals are actually preferable because learning curves are not smooth, and that we learn from our mistakes, and that it involves the gradual increase of learning, where learning together from failure becomes a critical element. The key to self-correcting spirals is high-quality performance feedback regarding an understanding of cause and effect relationships. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that idea of how to foster, that idea of self-correcting spirals and the importance of feedback to help teams understand cause and effect relationships. So the role of the leader in creating culture and that idea of fostering a sense of collective efficacy in schools is really about creating mastery climates. And you can see here the difference between a mastery climate and a performance climate. And one of the things that really resonates with me is a little ways down the chart on the left-hand side, this notion of encouraging joint work that's characterized by positive interdependence, because the research also shows that the relationship between collective efficacy and performance is maximized when there's positive interdependence amongst the group members. And so this notion of joint work is really characterized by the motivation for teacher teams to come together to collaborate, and that their motivation to do that is based on the fact that each other's contributions are required in order to succeed in independent work. It's this notion of teams coming together to deliberate over the difficult and recurring problems of teaching and learning. When we're engaged in joint work, and this is a term that I'm borrowing from Judith Warren Little, and her work, her seminal article, The Persistence of Privacy from 1990, she really paints a picture of what this level of collegiality or collaboration amongst teacher teams can look like. And she talks about the notion that it requires greater awareness of one another's beliefs and practices and greater reliance on verifiable information as a basis for preferred action. And so the role of the leader in thinking about fostering efficacy in relation to some of the things that we just talked about is helping teams interpret results and providing feedback in a timely manner. Changing that conversation from scheduling and field trips and collecting of hot dog money and that sort of thing to thinking about what's our impact and helping teams understand that cause-effect relationship. What's the impact when we tried this in our practice? What are we knowing about the strategies that are working and those that aren't? What do we know about the evidence-based practices and to what degree are they being implemented in our schools? And then how do we get a year's growth for a year's input and work together to make the strategies that we're using even better? And so this notion of knowing that collective impact, this I guess path pathways, these different pathways I'm going to share, was developed based on a conversation in the field with teacher leaders who were doing this work of joint work in the buildings, and knowing about how do we know the results from our work. And so the question becomes, did the results from your team's work show an improvement in student outcomes or no improvement in student outcomes? And if there was an improvement in student outcomes, maybe the leader's conversation with the team is, what is your understanding of how or why those results were achieved? Does your team have no understanding of how or why the results were achieved? Or does your team have a clear understanding of how and why those results were achieved? And the same questions could be posed if the results from the joint work showed no improvement in student outcomes. Does the team have no understanding of how and why the results were achieved? Or does the team have a clear understanding? And so ideally, if you look at those different paths, I'd pose two questions to you. One is, what path is your team currently on? And two, what path or paths are ideal? And usually when posed to an audience, people identify path 2 as desirable, and path 4 looks pretty good as well. It's that idea of cause-effect relationships, having a clear understanding of why we got the results that we did. If we're on path 1, where the results from our joint work showed an improvement in student outcomes, but our team has no understanding, was it luck or did the change in practice make a difference, and how can we find out? That could be some of the conversations that the leaders are leading in the work of school improvement. If it's path 2, where an improvement in student outcomes occurred and we have a clear understanding, what we have found in our work in the field is what gets people on path 2, which has been identified as an ideal path, is the fact that they brought student work to the table to collaboratively, collectively analyze. Not the notion of waiting for report card grades or annual standardized tests to see if what we're doing is working, not waiting to have those conversations till it's too late to adjust instruction, but bringing evidence of student learning, various artifacts from conversations, observations, student work products, and not an overwhelming amount where we're bringing evidence from the entire class, but 1 or 2 students that have piqued our interest and that we're hopefully showing progress in a particular identified area of student learning need over time. And when we see people get to that analysis level with student work, we find that they're on path 2. They gain clarity and understanding how and why the results were achieved. And what I find interesting is people start to differentiate based on this information, because they find as they drill down that the outcomes might not have improved for all groups, and then they identify additional scaffolds and supports that students need. So long are gone are the days of, ballroom professional learning where district office are telling educators, you must differentiate. Through this process, what we have found is educators begin to differentiate automatically because of the information that they have. And so then there's more to that path too, is what do others need to know? What are we learning? What information are we generating together as a professional learning community? Now, if we look at path 3, where there's no improvement in student outcomes and the team has no understanding, sometimes things get in the way. And I'll use Stephen Katz's term, activity traps. Those things that divert our time and energy away from what matters most, and that's a focus on student learning. And so it's just a matter of redirecting and figuring out how to get back on track. And if we're on path 4, there's no improvement, but we have a clear understanding. There's information there too. That's that idea of learning from mistakes and errors. And what I think too is sometimes it might be various reasons that there's been no improvement. Perhaps it was the right strategy at the wrong time. Professor Hattie's talking a lot lately about the importance of when to introduce certain strategies. And we know through his research that inquiry-based learning has a lower effect size. And for me, it was quite surprising because I thought it would have had a higher effect size, because it's a type of constructivist learning that I believe really could impact students. But he says that it depends on when strategies are introduced, and often inquiry-based learning falls flat when it's introduced too soon, when kids don't have enough surface level knowledge. And he cites a study that showed inquiry-based learning in medical profession had a much higher effect size when introduced in the 4th year of a medical program as opposed to in the 1st year. And that's because people have enough surface knowledge so that that can be an impactful strategy. So if it's on path 4, it's that idea of maybe the right strategy, the wrong time. Maybe it was the right strategy, but it hadn't been implemented with the fidelity needed to make it work. And the work of school improvement is really around figuring out how to make something that we know works in practice work in particular contexts. And so it's that notion of having those conversations and still knowing that we can learn something together as a team and continue to generate knowledge. So the role of the leader is really around creating opportunities for teachers to engage in collaboration that's focused on instructional improvement. It's that idea of getting people to engage in a level of collaboration, as Judith Warren Little defines as joint work. And this study I found interesting because it was a large-scale empirical study done by one of the leading researchers in collective efficacy, Roger Goddard and colleagues. Roger Goddard's out of the Ohio State University, and he's also created an instrument or a survey to measure collective efficacy. But what his research showed was some key things around how leadership doesn't necessarily have a direct impact on student achievement, but that the pathway in this research showed the leader had an indirect impact on student achievement by setting up cultures where collaboration are focused on instructional improvement, by putting opportunities in place for teachers to come together and figure out the impact they're having on student learning. And that collaboration fostered a sense of efficacy. Collaboration predicted the degree of collective efficacy in the school, and collective efficacy was a predictor of student achievement. Positive relationships shown in these variables in this particular study. So when we think about the role of the leader, we can think about opportunities also to create vicarious experiences. This is a second source of efficacy shaping information that teams use to determine to what degree they believe they can impact student learning. The first was mastery experiences, and that's again dependent on did we have success in the past. Vicarious experiences are a little bit different because they occur when we see other schools or other teams that are faced with similar challenges and opportunities meet with success. And by seeing that, we start to form expectations that if they did it, then we can do it too. And so what are some opportunities for leaders to foster vicarious experiences? It's this notion of increasing teachers' knowledge of each other's work as an enabling condition of collective efficacy. And so when we think about structures and protocols for deprivatizing practice, it really becomes important to think about engaging people in things like lesson study, peer observation, collaborative inquiry, where they're coming together. To me, it's synonymous with the notion of joint work, really digging into what it is that we need to know and be able to understand, and together generating that knowledge. It's really about teachers leading the work of school improvement and giving them authentic voices because they're the ones with the answers. This was a quote from a beginning teacher in a school district that I worked with a couple of years ago. And she was part of a team of teachers in the primary grades who were looking to improve student outcomes in mathematics. And they spent some time that year creating lessons and creating them together and then observing each other, teaching them. One teacher would volunteer, the others would come in, and they'd see how that lesson was playing out. And at the end of the year, I asked them, how has your collaboration impacted students? And this was the quote from a beginning teacher. She was in her first year. And it really resonated with me to talk about the importance of collaboration, because it shows to me that shift in expectations. So I'll just read the quote. Our common planning and then observations have made me feel more confident in challenging my students. At the beginning of the year, when you all shared what you had your students doing, in my head, I thought, my kids can't do that. But through our work together, I've seen otherwise. So in the beginning, and this was, very brave of her to share this. You could tell that there had been a lot of trust developed amongst this team. But she basically was sharing that she had very low expectations about what her students could and could not accomplish at the beginning of the year. But when she saw what other teachers, the rigor and the task that the teachers were putting forth in front of their students, she started to build up higher expectations. And we'll talk in a few minutes about the role of expectations in fostering efficacy as well. But you can also see that through their joint work, she increased her confidence or her efficacy in being able to not only impact and meet the needs of her students, but be a contributing member to the other teachers on the team. The third source of collective efficacy is social persuasion. And this is when teachers are persuaded by a credible and trustworthy other that they constitute an effective group. It's this idea that in your role as a leader, how might you use persuasion to convince people that if they take a risk, they're likely to achieve. And finally, the fourth source of past experiences that influence a team's interpretation of their effectiveness is referred to as affective states. It's those feelings of physiological things that take over your body, joy, excitement, etc. when you have met with success or when you've tried something, you've taken a risk and it's worked out. And on the other hand, it could work in the opposite direction. It's that anxiety that's associated with your interpretations of your capability and competence. And so what happens is those four sources based on past experiences are cognitively processed by individuals and groups and kind of in conjunction with the task that's at hand and the team's belief in their capability of meeting certain tasks and challenges. And as a result of that, people form their efficacy beliefs, both individually and in groups. So that is the idea of collective efficacy and how beliefs are formed. And in addition to that, they're not only formed based on past experiences, but contextual variables add power to the explanation of collective efficacy. And so we think about our ability to influence contexts, I think it's really critical to think about the key to achieving innovative and long-lasting changes that are needed to positively impact student success has to be done in context. There is no clear path. This is very much adaptive work, and we can draw on lessons from research, but the real work happens when we try to enact this in our practice, if that's something you aspire to, is fostering collective efficacy. It's very contextual and, again, adaptive in nature, so we can turn to research for some ideas, but the real work happens when you go back to your buildings and figure out ways to ensure teachers have mastery experiences and figure out ways to create vicarious experiences and socially persuade groups and celebrate when we've met with success. When efficacy is lacking, this is another thing that I find really interesting when we think about how to motivate teams to take risks. When efficacy is not present, teams show a significant reduction in the goals they set. And we know that goals are really important in relation to motivation. However, when efficacy is present, teams show greater motivational investments, and that is through goal setting as well. I'm going to just share a couple examples of this, and I found this study particularly interesting, and it looks at that relationship between goal setting and collective efficacy. And what this study entailed was it was called a masked experiment, and it was called that because the participants didn't realize that they were actually taking part in a research study. So there was some manipulation involved. They believed that they were signing up for a cycling competition on a stationary bike. And they were also told that the competition involved getting the best time goal and finishing place goal. And then they were randomly assigned to triads, so groups of 3, where they didn't know the other cyclers. And 13 triads were assigned to a high efficacy group, and 13 triads were assigned to a low efficacy group, Again, they're not realizing they're part of an experiment, and they don't know that they're part of these different groups. So then the teams were asked, the task was to complete a distance of, I think, 2,000 meters, something like that, on the stationary bike in the fastest time in their triad. And before they had a time trial, they were asked to set a time goal and a finishing place goal. And then what happened was they received bogus feedback between the time trials. So those that were assigned to the high efficacy group to get the bogus feedback, they were told they were in the top 5% and that the chances of them winning the competition were great, and that they had a really good chance at being the best team. And then the 13 triads who were assigned to the low efficacy group received bogus feedback as well. And their feedback sounded like, you're in the bottom 20%. Chances are your team doesn't have a chance at winning. And so, that's just the way it is. And then before trying again for the best time and finishing place goal, the triads were asked to set a new time goal and a new finishing place goal. And what happened with the group who had been assigned the low efficacy treatment, they lowered their goals. And that was directly as a result of that manipulation. That low efficacy feedback made them adjust their goals. But what's, I think, more interesting is not only did they lower their goals, they also decreased their efforts. They took longer in the next time trial and the time trials after that, after receiving that low efficacy feedback. So they lowered their goals and they lowered their efforts. Goal setting is a really critical thing. We've been asked to do it in education for quite some time. And in my experience, we don't spend enough time helping teams understand why goal setting is important or how it works. And so we can turn to some work based on research from the past. Vlock and Latham are very well known for their work in goal setting. And they'll tell us that goals direct attention to the task at hand, help increase persistence and effort, and help teams kind of, monitor progress toward those goals and figure out when something's not working. They help teams to develop new strategies. I turn also to the work of Vivian Robinson in the best evidence synthesis of school leadership practices and what works based on student outcomes. And she identified leadership practices, 5 in particular, that have a high impact in increasing student achievement. The number one is leading teacher learning and development, being a participant in the learning in your buildings. But you'll see there too, the second one with a high effect size of 0.42, medium size effect size, is that notion of establishing goals and expectations as a way to foster really motivation. The role of the leader is to help teams set goals and monitor progress toward those goals. And so I think that there's some work that could be done around understanding, again, more about how goal setting works. What are the conditions required so that the team needs the capacity to meet those goals? We have to foster commitment to specific goals. Goals have to be specific and unambiguous. And then the process, to me, is still important. This idea of creating that discrepancy as a leader between where the team currently is, the current reality, and the desired future state in a way to help motivate persistent goal-relevant behavior. Another process involved, of course, that idea of focusing attention and effort to the goals at hand. And then, of course, the consequences you'll see there. One is increased sense of efficacy, sense of purpose, priority, and greater involvement in enjoyment. The role of the leader in goal setting is ensuring that the goals are linked to a compelling moral purpose, that they're clear and unambiguous, of course, and that team goals, when we think about this, help facilitate the development of cooperative strategies, and individual goals are likely to encourage strategies that maximize individual performance. So how can we keep efforts focused on team goals, and what might those team goals look like and sound like in your environment? Stephen Katz and I, Dan mentioned at the beginning in the introduction, and I'm just so thrilled to be working again with Corwin and Dan as a fabulous editor. Stephen Katz and I are working on a book currently in getting, when we think about this notion of achieving quality implementation and the role of efficacy, this notion of goal setting becomes really important. And in our preparation for the book, we interviewed Stacey Allison, that you see here on the left. She's the first American woman to successfully climb to the top of Mount Everest. And she talked to us about the notion of goal setting and the importance of that. And of course, there's benchmarks or base camps in which they'd reach. And she talked about when the team was exhausted and they didn't think they could take another step, they just didn't have the energy to take another step and move forward, that they could look up and see the summit and be reminded of their goal. And she said just that alone, knowing what their goal was, gave them the energy that it took to muster up the strength to continue on their journey. And so I think of this notion of the base camps in Stacey's story and success, and thinking another important concept is, as the role of the leader, the notion of celebrating small wins in relation to the goals. And I love this quote that comes from The Power of Habit. This really ties this notion of small wins to collective efficacy. When teams experience small wins, it helps to fuel transformative changes by leveraging tiny advantages into patterns that convince people that bigger achievements are within reach. And so that importance of recognizing and celebrating when we make it to each one of those base camps on our way toward the summit. Another thing that's important to consider is when efficacy is lacking, it results in a self-fulfilling prophecy. The same is true when efficacy is present. And I think of this Pygmalion effect. And this really speaks to the notion of expectations. Again, I want to just kind of loop back toward that idea that I shared earlier. There is interesting studies in the 1960s done by a researcher named Rosenthal that looked at the power of expectations. And the studies began in science labs where they looked at rats, and lab technicians were told that certain groups of rats were bred to be maize brilliant and other groups of rats were bred to be maize dull. And at the end of the 6-week trial, the rats who were labeled as maize brilliant outperformed in a statistically significant way the rats who had been labeled maize dull, when in fact there is no difference between the groups of rats. Just a simple belief and expectation that some rats would outperform others made it come true. And so the researchers' theory was that the technicians handled the maize brilliant rats with more care and more often than the maize dull rats. So in the 60s, you could take this research into schools, and of course we wouldn't be able to do that nowadays. But Rosenthal took this research into schools and told teachers that certain groups of students had passed the Harvard Test of Advanced Intelligence when in fact the test didn't exist, and the students were randomly selected. And at the end of the year, coming back and seeing the results, students who had been labeled as exceptional outperformed their students on a number of measures. The same test has been repeated in the military. This particular group is command potential, and this other group you can't expect much. And at the end of basic training, of course, those who were labeled with higher expectations outperformed their peers. So we call this the Pygmalion effect. It's the idea that teachers' beliefs about their students to perform high levels influence the productive patterns of behavior, which impacts students' positive beliefs about their own ability, which causes students to act in certain reinforcing ways to their teachers. And so this notion that the opposite occurs as well. When we hold low expectations, they also lead to decreased performance. So a leader's role in the school, the importance of establishing high expectations and ensuring that we move from language that's around fixed mindsets to growth mindsets, and helping teams, again, make that connection between cause and effect relationships, where we can attribute success and failure to things that are within our control as opposed to things that are not within our sphere of influence. And so some big ideas here: the leader's role in fostering collective teacher efficacy. Just to do a quick review, some really big ideas again, and I hope that you take one or two of these away and try to start or continue to enact these in your practice. Or maybe after the webinar, do some more research or delve a little bit deeper into the notion of creating mastery climates. helping teams interpret results, and how to provide a feedback that's effective in fostering efficacy. Thinking about and talking with colleagues about how to increase the level of collaboration amongst staff so that, we know teachers can come together to reinforce the status quo. We also know teachers can come together to reinvent teaching and learning. So how do we ensure the collaboration is focused on instructional improvement? And what are opportunities for strengthening vicarious experiences so that teachers continue to learn from the great things that are happening in schools today? How do we use social persuasion? Again, keeping that in the back of your mind always, that when you have the ability to convince teams that they constitute an effective group, and that helps them to take greater risks. The notion of helping teams set goals and constantly monitoring progress toward those goals, knowing what those base camps are and celebrating the small wins when we get there. And then that also notion of establishing high expectations. And another important thing when we think about expectations is ensuring that we all have a common understanding about what we mean by that term, high expectations. I'm recalling a conversation I had once with a colleague where I was talking about high expectations, and there was a mismatch in our understanding about what that meant, because what he said to me was, I hold my kids to high expectations. I expect them to come to class prepared and on time. I expect them to have their homework completed and their notebooks neat and titles underlined and know when to get off their devices. And I thought to myself, those are important learning skills and work habits. But my notion of high expectations is that if I give kids difficult challenges, complex problems to solve, they will rise to the occasion. If I give them texts that might be difficult to comprehend, that they're capable of doing so. So that notion of expectations really boils down to what is the rigor in the tasks that we're providing to our students. And just to quickly give you some next steps if you're interested in delving more into the research. There are a couple citations there. The one is in the Journal of Educational Change, and I spent some time looking at what do we know about the research as far as how it impacts the patterns of behavior on the part of the adults in the building, and what are other positive consequences that come when efficacy is firmly established. And then also thinking in the second citation there in the Journal of Professional Capital and Community, what do we know? What does the research show about promising professional learning designs as far as fostering collective teacher efficacy? And so those might be some next steps. There's also more and more information available online. I was lucky enough to co-author an article with Professor Hattie and Rachel Ells, who has done a meta-analysis in the impact of collective efficacy in schools. And that's available in ASCD's Educational Leadership. And then more recently, Stephen Katz and I have written an article, co-published one in the Journal of Staff Development, which is now called The Learning Professional, through Learning Forward. And it makes the connections between joint work, as I tried to do in this short time together, and collective efficacy. And of course, you'll find lots of great blogs on Corwin Connect. A lot of authors are writing about this. A lot of teacher practitioners and people that are doing the work in the field are having these conversations and reflecting. And so there's lots of information that you can turn to next. I'm going to pause, and we have a few minutes. I'm going to turn it back over to Jeff to see if there are any questions. And again, he said that if there's not time to answer them all, which I suspect there won't be, I will make a commitment to, try to answer them through an email, and Jeff will put that out to the group. And I'll also hope that I'm able to answer the questions you have here on the screen. If I can't, I promise that I will follow up by looking for resources that could direct you in the right area.
Well, hi, Jenny. I have a few questions. Here's one. Does increasing student learning come before or after teacher belief change?
Okay, that's a great question. And again, it's hard to know which comes first. But the theory would be that, can you repeat, was the student learning come before or after change in belief, right?
Yeah, does increasing student learning come before or after teacher belief change?
So the theory would say that beliefs change after we see an increase in student learning. That student learning precedes the change in belief. That once we see evidence of improvement, and I'm turning to my bookshelf. A lot of this theory comes from Thomas Guskey, and the book is called Evaluating Professional Learning, and it's an excellent resource. It's an older book, but it's one I often still turn to today. And I know I've seen and read other educational experts with the same ideas. I know Michael Fullen and Andy Hargraves in Professional Capital talk about the notion of change in student learning preceding change in beliefs.
Thank you. I have another question. How do you suggest student outcomes should be measured?
That's a great question. And what I think is really important is the notion of looking at the students in front of us, not trailing indicators, but the data and the faces that we have currently in our classroom, and looking at outcomes in a number of measures. I think that some of these standardized tests provide us with information about patterns, but I think that the everyday assessments that we do in our classrooms are a better source and an important source for measuring progress. I think that outcomes could be looked at from the idea of how much progress are students making, and we can determine that based on evidence and artifacts of students that might be gathered through conversations, our observations, student samples of writing, student portfolios, looking at growth and progress from the students that are in our classrooms on a day-to-day basis, gathered from multiple measures. You can learn so much by having a conversation with a student about their experiences in schools. And I think sometimes that qualitative data isn't counted as importantly as some of the quantitative standardized tests. But I think that in the work that I've seen where teachers see that measurable change just based on a simple sample of student writing that might change over time in the course of a semester, seeing that growth in students' ability to infer, summarize, number of different cognitive strategies and skills that we know are so important. And those can be measured really by having those conversations with kids on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you. I have another question. Is it possible for a teacher to maintain high efficacy if surrounded by others who espouse low efficacy?
Yeah, and I think it is, because we're talking the difference between self-efficacy or individual teacher efficacy versus collective efficacy. There is a relationship between those two constructs that typically when self-efficacy is high, you'll see that there's more collective efficacy amongst the staff. But when we look at it on an individual nature, that I think it's very possible for a teacher to maintain a high sense of self-teacher efficacy, even in an environment that perhaps, or in a place where you're surrounded with people that don't have that same shared sense. And it's unfortunate because that leads to those isolations. It continues to, promote cultures that are less collaborative, where doors aren't open in classrooms. But I think that once a sense of efficacy is firmly established, it's really hard to break that pattern.
Oh, interesting. And that sort of leads to the next question. Does identifying students who are struggling or at risk through data analysis also lead to sort of a Gollum effect for those students?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Because we don't want to label kids and we want to have high expectations for all kids. And so I guess that the worry for me, or the caution, is in assigning those labels to kids. But we also need data to identify when students need additional support. So the data piece is critical. I think that my caution lays in creating those labels, and I think sometimes we're misled by our expectations, not only based on those labels, but in other ways as well. Somebody was sharing a story recently with me where, because his brother gave teachers a hard time. He had to work extra hard to let teachers know that he wasn't the same as his brother. So the caution is in checking our assumptions and making sure that we hold high expectations no matter what.
Terrific. I got another question. What are some of the effective tools that could be used to help develop leadership efficacy?
Well, I'm going to just defer to a colleague, an Ontario colleague, Ken Leithwood. Ken has a couple studies on the notion of principal efficacy and what organizations, schools in particular, can do from a superintendent level to foster efficacy amongst administrators. He wrote an article with another person, Jansky. I'm not sure. I'd have to look it up on my computer. But the reason I'm turning to Ken Leithwood is I know that he has a brand new book published next month. It's due out. I just ordered a copy of it 2 days ago through Corwin. And it's looking at exactly that. Based on a long-term study that Ken's done on some leadership work here in Ontario with principals. It is a good look, I think, and a good resource about, and the title's slipping my mind right now. Again, I don't have the book in my hand. It's available on the Corwin website. But in that book, Ken talks about how to foster principal efficacy. And I think in the end, what we find is the sources are the same. Whether we're talking about fostering efficacy in our students, individually, collectively, whether we're talking about fostering efficacy amongst adults, teachers, principals, mastery experiences are the most potent source of collective efficacy. So I think what we need to do is turn our attention to that. How can we foster mastery experiences for the students in our classroom? How can we ensure that principals have mastery experiences? What opportunities can we give principals to learn vicariously from each other? How can we identify the successes and help them understand those cause and effect relationships? So again, just look for that book from Kenneth. I think it's going to be a good one, and I'm looking forward to reading it myself.
And here's the last question. Can you recommend a book or article as a starting point for beginning the journey of collective efficacy at a school site? I'm looking for specific steps to increase collective efficacy from the very beginning.
And I hate to refer to myself. I'm going to refer to a couple, but on the previous screen, I think a good one would be the article that was co-written with me, Professor Hattie, and Rachel Ells in Educational Leadership. It's called The Power of Collective Efficacy. I think that would be a good starting point. Secondly, the article co-written with Stephen Katz, When Teachers Believe Students Achieve, and the Professional Learner. And also, like I said, on the Corwin Connect blog, there's great articles by people like Tommy Thompson, who's a principal in Connecticut doing this work in his school. You'll see articles that were really geared to administrators by Peter DeWitt, who's left the principalship to do a lot of this work and works closely with Professor Hattie and others in the field of building collective efficacy. So I think if you just do some searching, and again, I have a lot of confidence in the Corwin Connect because I know that the people that are writing for that particular blog have both a wealth of experience and bring a lot of research to their writing.
Terrific. That brings us to the end of the questions.
Excellent. I almost feel like this was a marathon and I've been being interviewed for a job.
Well,
I'm glad it's over.
They were terrific. They were great questions and your answers were great.
Excellent. Thank you.
And I think they hired you.
Yes.
Thank you. So with that said, I am going to turn it over to Sharon Pendergast, who is the Senior Marketing Manager for Corwin. And Sharon's just going to share a little bit more information with you as we wrap it up in the next few minutes.
Thank you, Dr. Donohoo, and thank you for the excellent presentation. So thank everyone for attending today's webinar on fostering collective teacher efficacy. Corwin will be following up with everyone attending this session within a week. We will send you the link to this presentation, which you are free to share. If you would like more information about this topic, we encourage you to explore Jenni's book, Collective Efficacy, How Educators' Beliefs Impact Student Learning, which can be found on www.corwin.com. For a limited time, you are invited to use the promotional code WEBINARS to save 20% on this title or any of Jenni's other titles. Could you advance to the next slide, please? If you're interested in bringing Jenni to your school or district for professional development, send us an email at info@corwin.com to request one of our professional development advisors to send you sample agendas and workshop availability for Jenni. The next Monday afternoon webinar series presentation will be on Monday. This one's an anomaly on a Thursday. Will be on Monday, September 24th with Ricky Robertson, and he will be discussing adverse childhood experiences. Corwin has a wealth of information available to you for free, including years of recorded webinars, the Corwin Connect blog series that Jenni mentioned earlier, and so much more. We invite you to explore these free resources at www.corwin.com. This concludes our presentation. Have a wonderful evening.